Welcome to part one of our explainer on transmission line modeling and voltage regulation. We're jumping right into distributed parameters, surge impedance loading, and conductor geometry today. So let's shatter a major illusion right off the bat. When you look at the power grid, it's incredibly tempting to treat those massive wires stretching across the landscape as basic, zero-delay connections. But here is the fundamental truth. Voltage travels. It doesn't teleport. A voltage change at one end of a long transmission line doesn't just instantly appear at the other end. It takes real, measurable time to propagate as a wave, moving at near the speed of light. And that single fact fundamentally alters how long lines behave. Because that wave takes time to travel, we literally can't just add up a single resistance and a single inductance and call it a day like we would for a short circuit on a workbench. The line is a highly dynamic environment. To really get this, you have to realize that every single meter of a transmission line has 4 elements distributed continuously along its entire length. If you zoom in on just a tiny segment, a delta X, you've got series resistance from the metal itself and series inductance from the magnetic field wrapping around the wire. But that's not all. You also have shunt capacitance from the electric field between the conductor and the ground, and tiny leakage currents that create shunt conductance, which is usually negligible. Because these 4 parameters repeat infinitely across hundreds of kilometers, simple circuit algebra totally breaks down. You absolutely need a wave equation to describe this precisely. Now, this interplay between the distributed capacitance and inductance creates what is basically a line's natural sweet spot. We call this surge impedance loading, or SIL. Let's break that down because it's a real game changer. The capacitance on the line naturally produces reactive power. Meanwhile, the inductance on the line naturally consumes it. SIL is the exact megawatt loading level where that reactive power production perfectly balances and cancels out the reactive power consumption. It is a rare moment of complete engineered harmony for that specific transmission line. But here is the crucial point. If you deviate from this perfect balance, the line's loading physically warps its voltage profile. This isn't just some abstract math problem, it's a very real physical stress on the grid. If you load a line below its SIL, the capacitive effect dominates, and the voltage actually rises toward the far end of the line. On the flip side, if you load it heavily above its SIL, the inductive effect takes over, and the voltage sags at the far end. But what happens when you hit that sweet spot? When you load a line exactly at its SIL, the voltage profile stays perfectly flat from the sending end all the way to the receiving end. The voltage magnitude at any point along that line is constant. This flat profile is a massive operational advantage. In fact, it's exactly why planning engineers have a built-in rule. They treat lines as being voltage limited when operating below SIL, and thermally limited, meaning constrained by the physical heat of the wires when operating above it. Okay, let's bring this out into the real world. Think about the physical towers, those giant metal structures you pass driving down the highway. You actually can't calculate a line's inductance, its capacitance, or its resulting SIL without knowing its exact physical geometry. Engineers rely on 2 critical metrics to do this. First is the geometric mean distance, or GMD. This captures the physical spacing between the different phase conductors on the tower. The second is the geometric mean radius, or GMR. This captures the internal flux linkage of the conductor itself, which includes any arrangement of multiple smaller wires grouped together to form one single phase. This geometry sets up a massive, direct design trade-off that tower engineers wrestle with constantly. The inductance per unit length scales with the natural log of the GMD divided by the GMR. In practical terms, you need to space your phases further apart on the tower so they don't swing into each other during high winds. But that wider spacing, that higher GMD, comes with a severe electrical penalty. It directly raises the line's series inductance and lowers its shunt capacitance, completely shifting the line's natural electrical limits. So, knowing how these geometry metrics impact the mouth, here is a quick check for you. Imagine you're the grid operator. How do you physically raise a line's capacity, pushing its surge impedance loading higher, without undertaking the insanely prohibitive expense of tearing down and rebuilding those massive steel towers to change the phase spacing? Think about the variables in that equation for a second. The elegant solution is to bundle the conductors. Instead of hanging one massive solid wire per phase, utilities will run a bundle of 2, 3, or 4 subconductors spaced just a few inches apart. By spreading the current out across this bundle, you drastically increase the effective GMR radius. And if we go back to our math, a higher GMR simultaneously lowers the series inductance and raises the shunt capacitance. This powerful combination pushes the surge impedance loading limit significantly higher. It's exactly why you'll almost always see bundled wires on high-capacity 400 and 500 kilovolt lines. Now, you might be wondering, why are we so utterly obsessed with controlling this voltage profile? Because every planning engineer on Earth lives by a golden rule. Steady-state voltage regulation must be held within a very tight band, usually about plus or minus 5% of the nominal rating under peak load. The stakes here are incredibly high. If the voltage sags too low, the grid browns out. If it spikes too high, you risk catastrophic, literally explosive insulation failure. And keeping things within that tiny 5% band is incredibly tricky, especially during certain hours of the day. Picture a 300-kilometer line at 3 a.m. The entire city is asleep, and power demand completely drops off. When a long transmission line is lightly loaded, well below its SIL, that capacitive effect we talked about earlier completely dominates. The far-end voltage climbs dangerously high, creating a surge phenomenon known as the Ferranti effect. To combat the Ferranti effect, grid operators obviously can't go out and change the physical geometry of the line at midnight. Instead, they use a brute force solution. Utilities must literally slam massive physical components called shunt reactors into the circuit during those light load periods. These reactors are essentially huge inductors that artificially add inductive reactance to the line. They absorb that excess reactive power produced by the line's capacitance, forcing the physics to behave. This pulls the voltage back down into that safe 5% margin and keeps the whole grid stable. So, next up is short, medium, and long line models. You came into this explainer treating a transmission line like a simple wire, and now you understand it as a dynamic, light-speed environment governed by geometry and reactive power. The theory is done. Next time we get into the practical circuit models you'll actually use on real-world studies to calculate this by hand. We'll see you there.